Hi, I'm Christina Olivieri, your paleo practitioner. Today's subject is going to be, why paleo? Well, paleo is a eating pattern that human beings have been doing for millions of years. It's getting a little traction recently over the last 10 years, mainly because of the high level of obesity and diabetes in our culture. So people have been doing a little bit more research into what should human beings really be eating. Well, if we look back to the original hunter-gatherers from which we all hail, we go back about 2.5 million years ago. That translates to about 76,000 generations, is the start of our current human genome. Now, throughout all of the planet, there's been many different hunter-gatherer societies, from the Inuit people all the way up in the northern climates, where it's very cold and they eat very few plants, all the way down to the equator, where there's very warm climates where people are eating a little bit more plant-based diets. But the main theme that we see throughout all of the hunter-gatherers, throughout all of human history, is a little bit higher in fats and proteins, low in carbohydrates, and practically devoid of grains and sugars. So another thing that we see back from original hunter-gatherer societies is that fish and large game were the main protein sources. Why? Well, fish is very high in omega-3s, and it's something that early humans were able to obtain. And large game, which is very high in fat content, especially when it's hunted during the high-fat time of the year, which is basically in the fall. The fall and the winter is when most animals are going to be have the highest fat content in their body and provide the most nutrition. Early humans also during this period, which is called the Paleolithic period, had very semi-active lifestyles. We may think that early humans had an active lifestyle that kept them very, very busy, physically active all day, every day, 24/7, but this is not true. Most human beings lived in communities and shared the workload. So you had the men who mainly went out and did the hunting, and the women who would do the gathering of tubers, vegetables, and some fruits, nuts, and seeds. So everybody had their job in the Paleolithic area, in these communities of early humans. Women would carry their children up until they were able to keep up with the adults, because the children went everywhere with the women. So women were carrying heavy loads to and from wherever they were doing their gathering. Men would not hunt on a daily basis. They would only hunt when it was necessary. So therefore, they would have highly active periods of time with lots of sprinting and heavy lifting. But they didn't do this all the time. Early humans had a lot of leisure time on their hands, especially when they lived in well-designed communities. They were very nomadic back then in the Paleolithic era, moving with the herds, moving with the weather in order to find food. Now, the lifespan and mortality events of the era, it's not what most people think. Most people think they died in their 20s and 30s. Well, they may have, but they certainly weren't dying of what we die of today. They weren't dying of heart disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's. I've had people say to me, well, you don't know that. No, we do know that. We do know what early humans died of. Number one, they died of murder. They died of infection. They died of injuries. Women frequently died in childbirth. And if she gave birth to a child at the wrong time of the year, child mortality was rather high. Because if mom can't make milk because she's starving, child's not going to survive. So we know what early humans died of. We also know what current hunter-gatherers die of. And again, they don't die of Western modern diseases. In fact, the Kidivas, which is an ancient culture that's still alive today, never see cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity is unheard of, and they certainly are not getting diseases like Alzheimer's and autoimmune diseases. These people can live into their late 60s and late 70s, which is what we've always believed to be a normal lifespan. Now, current day people are living longer than that. Yes, that's true. But very few are living without the help of modern medicine. After the Paleolithic era, we went into the Neolithic era, which started at about 10,000 to 8,000 years ago. This is only about 300 generations ago. This is a blink of an eye in human history. At that time, we started with the advent of agriculture and the domestication of animals. This started in Turkey and in eastern northern Africa. What happened at that time is humans realized that they no longer had to live a nomadic life following their food. They now had the ability to have agriculture and to bring farming techniques to be able to raise food. And the thing that they raised that was the easiest to raise was the grains. They started with ancient einkorn wheat and emmer wheat, as well as millet and spelt. And these were the most ancient wheats. Now, people did not eat these in large quantities. When you go from the Paleolithic era to the Neolithic era, you see that it really was just the people that were starting to live in small communities that were able to have a lot of these grains, these agricultured grains. So it was, a lot of people were still living a nomadic life. And we do see from Paleolithic studies that are done on the skeletal remains of these early humans that the ones that were still being nomadic and following their food and eating a lot of fresh foods, that these people were still hunting and gathering rather than farming, that their skeletal remains were a little bit more robust. Their muscle mass was much higher. In fact, right on the cusp from going from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic periods, we see that early humans had physiques that were very similar to current day super athletes. But then we see a few generations later, when we look at the early farmers in the Neolithic period, we see that they became much smaller, much more frail, because their main part of their diet was eating carbohydrates, especially grains. And we know this because we were looking at the skeletal remains of these early humans. So because the eating patterns changed quite dramatically from one era to the next, in that during that 8,000 to 10,000 period years ago, we see that they started eating a lot more carbohydrates. And like I said, the anthropological evidence does show sicker and smaller humans. Then what happened in the third period was only about 150 years ago, which only represents about 5 to 7 generations ago, which is nothing. It's hardly any time to make any kind of adaptations to our DNA. And what happened 150 years ago? The Industrial Revolution. That's when we really bumped up our intake of grains, because this was very, very cheap and easy to grow and process. We also started with processed foods. We started eating a lot of processed sugars, processed oils, and it became the dominant part of our food supply. And of course, it brings us to the modern day. So processed food, refined oils, refined sugars, all of these became huge 150 years ago. What else became very huge 150 years ago was we changed the way we domesticated our animals, our food supply. We started using CAFOs, which are confined animal feeding operations, or feedlots. So we took our cattle and our sheep and our pigs out of the fields and put them in small containers. We didn't let them move around very much because we didn't want to lose a single one, because it's expensive. The growers don't want to lose a single animal. So therefore their money yield was much higher, because when you put your animals out in the field and you let them graze for 4 or 5 years, there's a good chance you're going to lose a few. So the problem is that now what we're doing is we're eating a lot more refined meats. So currently, we're eating meats that are a lot higher in omega-6s rather than the healthy omega-3s. And they're also higher in saturated fat. Well, when you put animals into feedlots, they're pumping them up with antibiotics to keep from losing them, because they're in small containers, small areas where the animals are in close confined areas, and they can pass infections around. So therefore, we give them antibiotics. And we pump them up with lots and lots of steroids to make them have more higher meat content, a high body muscle content. And the fats are much, much poorer in quality. As I said, higher in saturated fats and higher in omega-6s, and much lower in omega-3s. So by eating these type of meats, and where we're eating animals that are not fed a natural diet, they're fed grains. Well, if I gave you a lot of grains to eat, you'd put on a lot of weight and you'd probably become diabetic, It's no different for our animals that we're eating. The chickens, the cattle, the pigs, the sheep. These animals are fat and diabetic, and that's what we eat. So it's unfortunate, but that's what's 99% of our food supply. So if you were to choose to eat more natural meats, like grass-fed beef and free-range organic chickens, and especially wild-caught fish, these animals are at least given the opportunity to have a natural diet rather than the man-made created grain-free and steroid-induced diet. So we really want to be eating a more natural diet as opposed to eating this artificial diet that has been brought to us through the Industrial Revolution. Our lifestyle has also changed very much in the last 150 years. People are much more sedentary. This is not compatible with our human genome. We need to move around, not terribly large amounts, but we do need to move around a lot more than we are. If you look at ancient cultures that are currently on the planet, and if you look at early humans, the remains, we know that they were much more physically active. And the main activity levels that they did were threefold. They did long, slow distances. They would walk to town, they would walk or bicycle to work. This is in more recent culture. And ancient cultures, of course, walked everywhere. They also would lift heavy things once in a while. As I said before, men would lift the animals that they would slaughter, or they would build some type of enclosures to live in. So they were lifting heavy things. Currently, we can mimic this very well by doing some weightlifting, or even using your own body weight in pull-ups, push-ups, things like that. The third type of activity that humans do really well is short sprints. This brings me to things like interval training, where you do a nice walk or a slow jog, and then you sprint for short periods of time. Things like this will be discussed more in some exercise video lessons. But ancient humans and the current hunter-gatherers on this planet were much more active than we are, but not to the level that you may think. Now, the onset of the modern era, which started around the late 1800s to of course, the 20th century, which are the 1900s. So our lifestyle is profoundly more sedentary. This is one of the reasons why we have a lot of modern health problems. And modern Western diseases are taking over. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, which is a combination of obesity and diabetes, and cancer. Cancer is absolutely a response to our current day lifestyles. I'm not saying that you won't get cancer if you lived 50,000 years ago. That we may never know. But we are pretty sure that it wasn't occurring at the level to which it's occurring nowadays in our society. And whether the cancer is something that is a genetic disease or an acquired disease. More research now is coming out saying that cancers are acquired. We're not born with a gene that's going to just turn on our cancer for no good reason. So cancer is being considered by geneticists to be an acquired disease, and it's usually from environmental factors. Now, the lifespan and quality of life in the modern era is really not as good as most people may think. Oh, sure, we can live to 90, no problem. And if you live a very healthy life by keeping yourself very physically active, and you eat very good quality food, low in high glycemic carbohydrates, like grains and legumes, keep your dairy to a minimum, and eat the most high quality protein from animals that you can, such as wild-caught fish and grass-fed beef, lamb, pork, and organic chicken, free-range, pasture-raised chicken and eggs, the best that you can. Yeah, you could live to 90. And I've seen some of my patients who hardly take any medications if they take anything. But the large percentage of Americans nowadays can live to 90 with only the help of modern medicine. And if you're going to be able to live to 90 but spend the last 10, 15, or 20 years of your life in a nursing home, I mean, you may find that to be a quality of life, but most people don't, especially the people that are going through it. So if you're young and you're thinking that's a normal thing to just get older, take medications in your 30s and 40s, more medication in your 50s and 60s, and lots of medication in your 70s and 80s, and then spend the last 10 or 15 or 20 years of your life in a nursing home rotting away, this is not normal. This should not be expected. But unfortunately, for the last 50 to 100 years, it's become normal. That doesn't mean that you should accept it. Now, currently, we have no real formal recommendations of what the macronutrients should be in our diets. Macronutrients being carbs, fats, and proteins. In fact, I just recently went to the American Diabetes Association conference, and even the ADA refuses to comment on this anymore. Now, those of you who may be able to remember the old-fashioned food pyramid that said that 50 to 60% of our diet at the bottom should be carbs, and it should be the high glycemic carbs, the breads, the pastas, the rice, the cereals, the pretzels, the pancakes, the cookies, the cakes, the muffins, the crackers, as well as potatoes and other starchy vegetables. Most people in medicine right now don't agree that that is the basis of a good, healthy diet. In fact, the ADA has now changed their stance from 50 to 60% of your diet being your high glycemic carbs at the bottom of the food pyramid, to now the plate method, which is only 25% to be whole grains. Well, I'll tell you right now that whole grains are absolutely not any better than refined grains. Oh, there may have been a time when we were eating emmer and einkorn wheat and millet and spelt, and we were eating it in its practically raw form with minimal processing, which would be grounding it down to a flour. But now we're eating mostly refined grains. That's all genetically modified, very high on the glycemic index. So if you want to be paleo, you really don't want to eat these foods. Now, the National Survey of Americans indicates that 45% of most Americans' diet is carbohydrates. 40% is fats, which unfortunately I believe way too high in unhealthy fats, and only 15% in protein. If you are considering to eat a Paleolithic eating pattern, I highly recommend that you go by what we do know that is the most healthy for healthy human beings, which is 33% carbs, 33% fats, and 33% protein. Now, you can vary that from day to day, but that should be your goal. There's certain apps, phone apps, and websites that you can go to in order to track what you're eating to see if you can try to keep your macronutrients into these three categories at these three percentages. The thing is that even me, and I do try to eat a very, very healthy diet, that I have a hard time keeping my protein up. Most of the days I can only manage to eat about 20% protein. And sometimes my carbs are too high and I don't eat any grains and hardly any legumes and very, very little dairy. But you will find that if you try to adhere to the 33, 33, 33 percentage, that it's not as easy as you think in our society. But it is a good goal. So all I'm saying is that I want you to try to eat a little bit more along the lines of what your DNA is designed to eat. What evolution has said is most healthy for your body. And a paleo eating pattern is the way to go. Thank you for letting me be your paleo practitioner.